So Dan Alone, the Forgotten 15th, and he's also implemented some slides with a couple of folks that reached out to us this week. Some are here. So he's implemented that, but we are really in for a treat, so let's give it up for Mr. Dan Alone.
Thank you so much. Thanks. How many of you know anything about the 15th Air Force? Oh, geez. Usually I teach adult ed, and what's one of the best things about teaching adult ed is most of the time you guys don't know anything. So, you can say what you want, but there's too many hands came up this time. So I'm like, oh, God. It means I had to read this stuff. But a year or so ago, I did a presentation on the 8th Air Force. And the reason I did the presentation is because I didn't know anything about it. And so Brent said, well, why don't you do a presentation? Since you don't know anything about it, you'll be able to discover stuff that a lot of other people may not know and you think's really pretty neat. So I made the mistake of talking to him about the 15th Air Force, which I didn't know anything about. And so I started reading about the 15th Air Force, and it's actually known as the Forgotten 15th. There's not anywhere close to the number of books written about the 15th Air Force compared to the mighty 8th, although it has a very good history. So get right into it. The 15th Air Force. It's established on the 1st of November 1943. Doolittle is going to be in charge of it. They established the 15th Air Force. They took the bombers out of the 12th Air Force and then also stole airplanes from the 8th Air Force. But they stood up the Air Force, but they didn't have any place to put it. The runways weren't ready to go. The bases that they eventually took over, which are in Foggia, Italy, there's about 20 bases there. And they had initially been Italian air bases, and then when Italy switched, they became German air bases, but mostly for fighters. So the bases were too short, and the Italians, for some reason, aren't real good about figuring out how to pour concrete. So a lot of the bases were in horrible shape. Plus, we bombed the heck out of them when we were taking over southern Italy. So the bases weren't ready. So a number of the first mission for the 15th Air Force actually flew out of Tunisia before they were able to move into Foggia. The 15th Air Force was the red-headed stepchild for everything. When it came to replacement crews, when it came to airplanes, when it came to equipment, when it came to food, when it came to anything, the 15th Air Force was always second place. Doolittle took over 2 months, and then after 2 months he was moved up, and General Twining came in. He eventually became, I think, the first Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and then also became Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They began with B-17, 3 B-17 groups, and 2 B-24 and 3 P-38 groups. I was in the Navy, so I could care less about groups or squadrons or talking with my hands or any of the stuff that the Air Force guys do, right? So a group, a squadron for the 15th Air Force would have anywhere from 12 to 18 airplanes, and then there was 4 squadrons per group, and then you can see the groups that they had. Initially, they only had P-38s. Eventually, they got P-47, and then later on, they got the P-51 after the 8th Air Force got the majority of their P-51s. They eventually grew to 20 bases around Foggia, and then they ended up with 21 bomb groups, 7 fighter groups, and including the 332nd Fighter Group, which is the Red Tails. That's one of the most popular stories about the 15th Air Force. Almost everything else is unknown unless you start really digging for it. There's 2 factors when they decided to create it. It was geography and weather. Geography, the idea was that they're going to be a lot closer to the manufacturing and oil that's in Germany and then also in Romania. So by being closer, remember from the 8th Air Force, those were long missions in there, and they were all unaccompanied by fighters. If you start out in Italy, you're going to be able to have fighters go with you most of the way in the beginning, and then you're also going to have fighters able to escort you back out. And the mission distances are a lot shorter. So that was a geography. But one of the things that they didn't count on was where the different mission areas were. They went west over Corsica and into France. They went north over the Alps into Germany and Austria, Poland, some of those areas. And then they went east, and they went over the mountains into Greece and into Romania and those areas. So the geography was a heck of a lot harder than what the 8th Air Force was flying. One of the things I found in reading about the 8th Air Force, the 15th, was you read about the 8th Air Force, these guys would lose 2 engines. And they could fly back at 500 feet and make it to England. And they could do all these different things with 1 or 2 engines or with the turbochargers out, things like that. The 15th, if you went over the Alps, if your engines weren't operating correctly, you were going to have a difficult time getting back up to 12,000 feet. And then you had to make a choice, what are you going to do? You can try, and then if you land in the mountains, everyone's going to die if you hit the Alps. Or you can try to ditch somewhere else. You can go try to get to Switzerland, try to get to different areas. Or Yugoslavia, where the different underground groups are operating. But geography didn't turn out exactly what the planners thought. Next was weather. They thought southern Italy has nice weather. You can go on a cruise, everything's great. One of the things that ends up happening is if you compare the time between when the 8th Air Force is operating and the 15th Air Force is operating, the 8th Air Force had 20% better days. The 15th Air Force was shut down more than the 8th Air Force. But the planners, we didn't know anything. I mean, if you read any of this history, we had no clue where Foggia was. We had no clue what anything was around there. It's hard to find maps. You can see it, but here's a map that shows the ranges for the different airplanes, where they could go into Hungary, into Romania, Bulgaria. They're having to go to all these different distances. They're also having to fly over water a lot more than the 8th Air Force is having to do. If they head west into France, they're flying over water. Here they're flying over a couple different bodies of water. It was a very difficult missions. Here's another map. This is the one that John just brought, and it shows the coverage of where the different bombers could go. One of the other things that, here's what they flew. They flew the B-17, the B-24, the P-38 Lightning. They eventually got the P-47. They were, for the Lightnings and the P-47s, they were also but the 12th Air Force was trying to get these different airplanes. And these guys were further away. So if you imagine the ships coming from the United States, any ship that's coming in, if it's made it across through the Battle of the Atlantic, everybody's trying to get everything off that ship before it gets all the way to Italy. Like I said, redheaded stepchild. Here's a picture of the one of the Red Tails. They eventually got the P-51s, and that's after the 8th Air Force got their P-51s. They had a different bombing formation. They called it the Diamond. And then you have this group here, and there's actually, I couldn't find a picture that shows the elevation, but these 4 are actually lower than these 4, and that's how they did it. And it was a different configuration than what the 8th Air Force was using. Here's some of the people they had to fight. You have the Italians, you have the Slovakians, you have the Hungarians, you have the Bulgarians, and you have the Romanians. So I was watching, this I didn't have anything to do, I was watching an Air Force training film, and it was talking about getting ready to go on the Puleshti mission. And if you watch this training film, it basically tells these guys, our guys, you have nothing to worry about. You're going to be flying against, the Romanians, or you're going to be flying against the Bulgarians. And you know what they're like. Well, most people have no clue where those countries even are. And it's basically racist or bigoted training films that these guys don't know anything. You got to remember, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, they've been fighting since 1940. So even if the Russians didn't have great airplanes, these guys were still doing aerial combat. And we have our 19-year-olds coming over, and you're being told, don't worry about it. They can't do squat. Well, maybe this airplane can't do much against the Mustang, but it can do a lot of damage against the B-24 or B-17. And the casualties were horrendous. The other thing, when you're talking about any of it, we're shooting with 50 caliber. The Germans and their allies are shooting with 20 millimeter. So who can do the most damage? And what I don't have in this picture is like when we talked about Bomber Command, they were using 30 caliber, which is about this big. And that's what the Brits were using, which was 30 caliber, if you can imagine this stuff. One of the other things, when you read any of this stuff, you wonder, didn't they ever do lessons learned? It really doesn't seem like it. I mean, on a lot of this stuff, right? It doesn't seem like there was a lessons learned project. The other thing that they were against, this is really innovative, and these were train tracks and special trains with anti-aircraft guns. And if you know anything about flak, you don't have to hit the airplane, you just have to get the round up close to the airplane so that it can send small pieces of metal out. The majority of the planes shot down, 15th Air Force planes shot down, were shot down due to flak. And here's a couple different flak guns. This is the, I think it's 105 millimeter. It could get up to 30,000 feet. One of the things that happened is after the first couple missions, Albert Speer, he figured out we need to get some good flak in there. And they did. They brought the flak in, they brought tons of it in, and they could blanket anything at any altitude. And they had quite a bit of it. This is Ploiești, Romania. You may have heard about Ploiești. The first refinery was in 1857, and it was the first refinery in the world to export oil. So they were ahead of John Rockefeller. The Romanians they joined the Axis after Romania's two main guarantors, United Kingdom, Britain, and France, were basically kicked out of the war. And they had signed treaties with Romania that they would guarantee Romania's territory. Well, they couldn't do anything. They didn't do anything. So Romania signed an agreement with Nazi Germany. One of the things that the Nazis didn't tell them was, oh, by the way, we signed an agreement with the Russians, and you are about to lose quite a bit of territory. And the Romanians lost a lot of territory as a result of that. And then they joined the Axis on November 23rd, 1940. Ploiești, if you've ever seen any of the movies about it, there's 10 refineries there. It's not just one refinery, and these are spread out over a 30 square mile area. And these are massive, massive refineries. And if you remember anything from anything about the 8th Air Force or anything, the Brits had the right idea, and that's carpet bombing. We stuck with precision area bombing. It just was precision area bombing over a large area. And one of the problems that they had with Ploiești is you're coming in to try and bomb something, you had to go after specific things in the refineries. There's certain portions, like the power plant, there's certain portions of the refinery that you have to hit. You can blow up the big tanks that look pretty and make a big bomb explosion and show up great in your photographs, but that does absolutely nothing. They could rebuild that in 1 or 2 days. And Ploiești provided 30% of Germany's petroleum, oil, and lubricants. Although Germany, before the war started, they were producing synthetic oil, there's certain lubricants that you needed that could not be produced synthetically. And that's really what the Germans needed out of Ploiești. One of the interesting things, when you look at any of the German propaganda magazines, it's always tons and tons of tanks going in, like in the Blitzkrieg, when they went into, or Operation Barbarossa. Well, Barbarossa, the numbers are 600 to 700,000 horses going in there. So, but the Germans still needed lubricants. The Germans, nobody studies any history. The Germans weren't food sufficient in World War I, and they weren't energy sufficient in World War I. They weren't food sufficient when they started World War II, and they weren't energy sufficient when they started World War II. And both of those things was one of the big reasons they lost the war. So this is Ploiești, and this becomes one of the main targets for the 15th Air Force. One of the problems is when you start reading this stuff, there's so many interesting stories, and you try to figure out which one to follow. And talk about it before you guys all nod off. It's like, I got to find some great stories. So I went to Ploiești. Anybody know when the American first heavy bomber mission was in Europe?
August of 1942.
Wrong, grasshopper. No, nope, wasn't the 8th Air Force. Ha! See, you raised your hand as you knew something about it. Operation Halpro. Anybody ever heard of Operation Halpro? This is called the Halverson Project. And Halverson, he's a colonel, and he was a friend of Spaatz, and he also had a number of early air, not medals, but different accomplishments, like air-to-air refueling, all these different things. So Halverson and his group of 23 B-24s, they were going to China, and they were going to be stationed in China to help, against the fight with Japan. Well, Japan overran the bases that they were supposed to go to, so they ended up in Egypt. And this is great too. So they go Miami to Brazil to Liberia, and then across Liberia end up in Sudan, and then from Sudan to Egypt. They get to Egypt and they say your bases are gone, there's nowhere for you to go. So they're stuck in Egypt, and somebody says, well, we need to do something with these guys, so what are we going to do? So they decide, knowing that Ploiești is the fuel source for the Germans, this is what we have to do. Now this is 22, this is, oh no, I don't have the date. It's the beginning of June. So this is 3 months before the 8th Air Force has their first heavy bomber mission. They fly, now here, this is the great planning from the Halverson. All right, take your plane, fly to Ploiești, try to hit something, turn around, come back, and land, and try to get to Iraq. You can't go over Turkey because Turkey's a neutral country. Well, then Halverson said, well, go over Turkey if you have to. So they flew over Turkey, they bombed Ploiești, they do absolutely no damage at all, nothing that can't be repaired in a couple days. They don't lose any planes, but on the way back, you can see the casualties. 9 landed scattered all over Iraq and Syria, and 4 were interned in Turkey. It's the first U.S. strategic mission, which is a failure. And this is the best part. If you remember with the 8th Air Force, which was the dogma that the 3 top guys had, was that through bombing, we can put any country into submission and we won't have to put troops on the ground. Remember, that's the whole idea of the 8th Air Force, and that's one of the things that they stayed with the whole time. And look at the comment from Eisenhower, that this failed mission did something to dispel the illusion that big planes can win the war. And this is middle of 1942, and you're already starting to have that argument between the powers that be. So here's a couple maps showing you the mission. This is the next mission on Ploiești, and this was a big mission. This was 178 planes, and they're going to knock out Ploiești. This is in 1943. They take off from Benghazi. You can see the different tracks that they had to go, and this was a super secret mission. They took bombers from the 8th Air Force, B-24s. They brought them down to Africa. They trained in Africa. Everything was supposed to be a low-level bombing. So these guys trained flying in at 200 feet. That's what they were supposed to bomb at. And then the idea was that they would sneak up through Tyrrhenian Sea, and they'd sneak up on Ploiești. Nobody would know they were coming. So it's 178 B-24s. Nobody knows they're coming, except for the Germans. The Germans know, because somebody sent a radio message to another base, and the Germans had cracked our code. Someone had sent a message that there's 178 bombers heading north, and it's like, you can't make this up, okay? So then the plan was a super secret plan that they would come in from different directions at the exact same time, overwhelm the flak, drop the bombs, and then everybody would get out and make it home. And then a lot of the bombs were on timers. They had set for a specific amount of time so that everybody could get out. Well, one of the first things that happened, the first airplane that they lost, and nobody knows why, but it had the lead navigator on it. And it went into the ocean, into the sea. Everybody was killed. They were also in radio silence, so no one's going to talk, but this is the lead navigator. So then the colonel that's running the plane, they head into Ploiești. Everybody's supposed to come in this way at different times, hit it at the same time. The lead airplane screws up their calculations, and he turns early. And he turns right here, and he comes around. The follow-on guys are all saying, this is wrong. You're screwing this up. This is not going to work out. But it's radio silence. No one wants to say anything. One of the colonels from one of the squadron said, these guys are idiots, and he took his planes on the right route. He flew the same thing. This guy, the lead bomber with his squadrons, comes all the way around here. Like, do we have enough time to wake up all the guys to work the anti-aircraft guns? I mean, this is horrible, but that's what happened. So he comes all the way back around. But by the time he gets here, these guys have already come in, and then they've dropped their time-delayed bombs. They're also coming in at 200 feet. You can't make this up. I mean, the screw-up was so bad. So by the time these squadrons come around, these time-delayed bombs are going off. So these poor guys are flying in at 200 feet, and the time-delayed bombs are going off, and they're driving into it. The flak is there. There's one survivor in one of these squadrons was talking about it. You can find him on YouTube. They were low enough that one of the anti-aircraft trains was in the mountains right around Ploiești, that they were shooting down at his B-24. And the only guy that could shoot back at him was the top turret. And he said the guys were all just praying because this train was doing the same speed that his plane was doing, and he knows they were doing it because the smoke coming out of the engine was flat across the top of the train. So I mean, these guys just walked into just a horrendous butcher job. So they lost, where's the raids here? So this is Operation Tidal Wave was the first one, 178, the 1,200-mile journey. It was the Navigator, and it went downhill. 52 bombers were shot down. 52 bombers. Now, if it had worked, everybody had made it on time, and that's one of the problems is, you know, if you plan anything, everything goes wrong, right? And the planner was a beautiful plan until they took off, unfortunately. But everything was precision, exactly how these guys were going to come in. We're going to overwhelm the anti-aircraft, and we're going to get out of here with limited number of casualties. It didn't work. So they lose 52, 310 KIA, 108 POWs, and 78 in Turkey. Production was temporarily affected, and then within 2 months they were back up. They were actually over production what they were doing on this raid. Shortly thereafter that, they canceled all the raids on Ploiești after that because the casualties were too high, and then they had to get on to other missions. There was the invasion of Normandy. There was different missions that they tried to coordinate with the 8th Air Force. It was called Big Week, if any of you studied about the 8th Air Force. And it was supposed to be 5 days that the 8th and the 15th are going to coordinate, and they're going to destroy German aircraft manufacturing. Well, nobody told the weather gods what you were supposed to do. So the days that the 8th Air Force flew, the 15th couldn't fly. The days that the 15th flew, the 8th Air Force couldn't fly. And so a lot of these ideas of overwhelming the targets with so many bombers would save you both from the fighters and both from flak. And Big Week was horrendous losses. It got up to, I think it was like 26% losses. And all that's unsustainable. And June 10th, 1944, since the bombers weren't working, now this is almost a year later, they come up with a plan of send in P-38s. So they send in 92 or 96 P-38s. So half were supposed to fly cover, and the other half, see, I'm talking with my hands. Half was supposed to fly cover, and the other half is supposed to dive bomb on the factory at specific targets. Like I said, it was supposed to be energy centers, or there's some other different things in refining. I don't know, I'm not an engineer. There's different buildings that they had to hit. And if they could hit those buildings, they would put the refineries out of business. It didn't work. The Germans and the Romanians had 250 fighters already up in the air because they had been warned as these planes came up the Tyrrhenian Sea. They had been warned that there's planes coming. And so all you had to do is figure out what time did you see them and how long will it take to hit Ploiești. Also, Albert Speer, not an idiot, they moved so much anti-aircraft equipment into that area that it just overwhelmed anybody coming in. And you can see they had over 24 missions that the 15th flew against Ploiești, 230 aircraft. By August 44, the input, August 44 is when Romania changed sides, and the input was down by 90%. It was a horrendous risk. Now here's some pictures that you may have seen. These are all famous pictures. These are all from the Ploiești raid. All these pictures are from one guy. The casualties were so high, they sent 16 combat photographers up there, motion picture and still shot, and only one guy made it back. These are all one guy's photographs. You can't make it up. And then you can see, and now with our precision bombing, well, the Norden bomb site's not going to work at 200 feet. at all. And so you had to hit specific targets within any one of these 10 refineries. Yeah. There's pictures of B-24. Here's one that's crashed. These are Hungarian officers climbing all over it. So trying to figure out, instead of doing a bunch of missions, one of the things I wanted to talk about in the limited time is, anybody ever heard of Operation Halibird? So Halyard, that's why you didn't hear Halibird, because it's Halyard. Anyway, so Operation Halyard was August 2nd to December 27th, 1944. Anybody know who this guy is? Milosevic. He's a Chetnik. Anybody know any history about Yugoslavia? So in Yugoslavia, you have the Germans are in Yugoslavia, but you have the Chetniks, who are basically thinking that the monarchy should be put back, and you have Tito, who's a communist, and he thinks he should be put back. Well, Tito didn't do a whole heck of a lot for these guys getting shot down. The number of people being shot down on the return, on either to or the return from Ploesti and some of these other missions out in the east, were landing in Yugoslavia. The Chetniks, he put out that you are to treat these Allied bombers, because there's also Brits coming in on 9 missions, you're to treat these these crewmen like they're your family. You're to feed them, you're to protect them with your life. It eventually gets up to about 1,100 pilots and crew that are in the Chetnik areas. Tito's doing not much of anything. Here's a picture of, they sent in OSS agents for Operation Halyard, and the idea was, we're going to figure out how to get these guys out. Well, Yugoslavia is all mountainous, so these airmen and people in this village of Pranja scratched out a runway that could handle our bombers or C-47s. They scratched it out by hand and built a runway. And we brought in airplanes and eventually took out 1,100 flyers back to Italy. Here's some pictures of some of the people. You can see the hats, the Yugoslavian hats, and there's Milosevic. Milosevic now is not a communist. Here's a picture. One of the things that the crewmen did as they were getting on, they all stripped off their boots, they stripped off their winter jackets and gave them to the people, because the people were, the area that they were in was grudgingly poor, was horrendously poor, yet these guys, these men and women, all came out and dug and built a runway with hand tools so that the Americans could get out. Now, enter the Brits. So the Brits, Yugoslavia was considered their area of operations, and there was a Soviet mole in MI6. How unusual. So there's a Soviet mole there, and he convinces Churchill and the Brits that Tito is the guy to back and not Milosevic. Milosevic, like I said, wants to bring back the monarchy. So the Brits start putting everything towards Milosevic. When the Operation Halyard was first planned, Churchill said, not going to happen. Not going to happen. Tito's our guy, and you're going to give credit to Milosevic, who's doing the stuff. Well, Americans, we're sitting here saying, yeah, but Tito's not doing squat. All Tito's doing is trying to kill Milosevic. So against Churchill's orders, Roosevelt orders the mission. The OSS goes in, they coordinate it, and then they bring all these people out. One of the things that the OSS also then said to Milosevic is, if you and your top guys, we'll take you out if you want, because we can see what's coming. And he says, no, I'm not going to do it, I'll stay. Of course, he stays, and then he's executed in 1946, and then the whole mission is kept secret. It's not for at least 20 years or more until this mission is even talked about, and then it's some of the men who had survived were trying to wonder, why isn't this part of the lexicon? Why isn't anybody talking about this stuff? And we squashed it because Tito was the Brits' guy. And then we were embarrassed to say that we basically abandoned him. Last summer, they had a big memorial ceremony, and they actually had some crewmen actually come back to the village, Pranja, and celebrate, and they put in a plaque, both for the people that built the runway and then the airmen that they saved. Is Mr. or Mrs. Webb here? Okay, so we put in your dad's picture. You want to tell us about it? I'm putting you on the spot. It saves me a couple minutes.
Lee Fowler, 76 Squadron. and got over to, what's his name? I told you that, that's this, Rotagna,
Okay.
with 449. He stayed there, and they bombed Innsbruck and other places, Vienna.
They went to Auschwitz. They went to Auschwitz. Isn't that your dad's newspaper article?
Yeah,
That-
he flew, long story, they had an engine problem. And they took off late, and everybody was, of course, they were not supposed to be talking on the radio. So he said, we're in with this group, and we knew it wasn't us. We said, well, they may be going to Innsbruck like we were supposed to. So what happened is they get up to Innsbruck, they fly over Innsbruck, and keep going and going and going. They flew to Poland. And of course, his crew chief said, sir, we're not going to get back home. We don't have enough gas for this. He said, well, let's drop our bombs and go back. So they turned around and started flying back. And, they got partial way back, and they had holes in the plane, and it lost part of an engine, and they had to fly down to Viz, which is an island in the Mediterranean, right down the Adriatic. And as he got there, you've probably seen what I said. He goes in and he says, they got within about 5 miles of the base, and the engineer says, we're out of fuel. And he said, well, hell, we're going to either crash in the water, which B-24 is a lousy plane.
Right.
It's a death trap. And so he said, well, I'm going to take it all the way as long as the gas lasts. So he gets to come into the runway, and the British tell him, don't come in, because the bomber was crashed and blown up on the runway. So that was a great pilot. So he goes in, he says, you know, I don't have a choice. We're going to die in the water, get across this. So he puts the plane down and jumps over the burning wreck. He goes down to the end of the strip. He says, as they're taxiing off all his engines.
Because they're out of fuel.
And so he said they stayed on the island for a couple of days, and then they flew them back. He said, because of that, we flew the longest mission for the 15th Air Force.
So I like to go down rabbit holes. So the 716th Squadron flew one of the first missions over Budapest. So here's something interesting. Up until the time that the Germans came into Hungary in the spring of 1944, they would not put anything up against us. We could overfly Hungary, even though they were a member of the Axis, without any problems. So also, some of the first missions that the 15th Air Force was doing were called morale missions. What do you think a morale mission is? Kill civilians. Some of the first missions that we sent, they were called morale missions. And a lot of the pilots had a problem with it because the orders were head to Sofia, Bulgaria, and bomb the city. And they're in a briefing and they're like, what are you talking about? What's that? Bomb the city. The same thing with Sofia, Bulgaria, and then Bucharest, Romania. Bomb the city. We're having problems with this stuff. And the idea was, because it worked on the Brits, remember? Germans, you keep dropping on the Brits, they'll surrender. That didn't work. Then we did the same thing to the Germans. Keep flattening the German cities, they'll surrender. They'll rise up against their government. Well, that didn't work. We also did it in the Pacific. Bomb the Japanese so that there's nothing left because they'll rise up against the emperor. That didn't work. But we sent them out on these morale missions, which was to bomb cities. And there was a lot of problems with these pilots, navigators and bombardiers, saying something's not right. So in April of '44, Adolf Eichmann, the Hungarians are about to lose the war. Adolf Eichmann comes into Hungary with 150 SS men and they facilitate things to deport the last group of Jews in Europe, and that's the Hungarian Jews. It's about 450,000 of them. And so Eichmann sets it up with the Hungarians doing all the rounding up. The Germans are just figuring out what trains come and when they go. The Hungarians are rounding up their own civilians. Prior to this time, so a booklet called the Auschwitz Protocols had been smuggled out of Auschwitz, and it was a detailed description of exactly what had been happening to European Jewry in Auschwitz, just in Auschwitz. It was very detailed, it had numbers, and it was from 2 Slovakians that worked in an office. They smuggled this out. It finally gets to the United States, and then the Swiss start protesting about what's happening, and then Churchill, FDR, King of Sweden, finally gets on board. He's had an epiphany. They warned Horthy, who's the head of Hungary, that you better stop deporting your Jews because you're going to be tried as a war criminal after the war. Now, having nothing to do with anything, the 716th, which I don't know if your dad was there at the time, the 716th flew a mission that had been pre-planned to bomb Budapest. When these bombers came in on one of their morale bombings to bomb the center of Budapest, Horthy took that as the warning that Churchill and Roosevelt had issued, that you're going to be tried as a war criminal, and he kicked Eichmann out. And as a result of that, that stopped the trains to Auschwitz. And that was the last major group that went to Auschwitz. See, I can go down a rabbit hole anywhere. But it's an incredible mission if you think of like the unintended consequences. You're trying to kill Hungarian civilians so they'll overthrow their government, which is not going to happen, but you scare the leader to stop the deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. Here's another picture. This is your dad, right?
Yes.
And your mom, their wedding day, 727th Squadron, right? 454th Bomb Group, 15th Air Force, 35 B-24 missions. It's incredible, these different numbers. Here's a rabbit hole. This guy, Lieutenant Tom Faulkner, 737th Bomb Squadron, 454th Bomb Group. He flew 28 missions and was shot down before he was 20. So he's 19 years old. He's on a mission to Augsburg, Germany, and he hits some shrapnel. And one of the things that he does is before even getting there, his navigator had been taken off and put on another plane, and he had a brand new navigator. This was his first mission, and they're in the bomb run. Something hits his plane. Before he got there, he had already had trouble with the turbochargers or different parts of the engine, so he was already, behind the 8 ball in flying, knowing that he's not going to be able to go back out over the Alps. So he's in the middle of the mission. All of a sudden, he's losing 500 feet per minute. He radios breaks radio silence, radios to the squadron commander. I'm losing 500 feet per minute. I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but I'm going to try to head for a neutral country. He radios that out. His navigator screwed up. He decided to head to Switzerland, but the navigator had no idea where he was going. So they overflew Switzerland, and then he's like, he's trying to figure out, and they're trying to understand why they haven't heard anything from the navigator. We haven't heard any news late. So he turns around and then comes back, and they're trying to find Switzerland. Unfortunately, the navigator has no clue what's going on. And I mean, it's interesting, but you try to figure everybody's in extremis, right? They're trying to figure out. One of the other things, this guy flew his missions, he almost never had the same co-pilot that everybody else had. He was always getting a new co-pilot. The co-pilot was also on his first mission. So here he is trying to figure all this stuff out, and he has 2 brand new people that have not been up there, that no one's there to correct him or give him advice or do anything else. So they're flying along, and then some Swiss Me-109s come up next to him and then force him to land. And they force him to land. One of the things he found out after the war was they were actually over Germany, and the Swiss were like, move over, and you're not going to get shot down. Now, one of the choices that these guys had, too, again, is you can crash into the Alps and you're going to die because it's going to be so cold, there's no way that you're going to survive. So here's something that was very interesting. So they land in Switzerland. the Swiss take all these airplanes. Here's a great picture. The Swiss take all the airplanes and they do an assessment of them, of what's wrong with the airplane. The Swiss do an assessment that he had problems with the turbochargers, whatever it was, he was never going to make it over the Alps. And they wrote reports on every one of these airplanes. There's hundreds of them. The Swiss then use them for the Swiss Airlines. That's another whole story. So the Swiss use these different airplanes and they write up this report. So he's in a ski resort as a prison. By the way, he saves all 9 of his guys and himself. He's in a ski resort, and then there's an agreement is worked out between the Swiss, between the Germans and the Americans, and he's repatriated, which is unusual, but he's repatriated back to the United States. Goes back, doesn't see any of his guys again. Goes back to the United States, and one of the things he writes about, he was then mustered out because the war ended, and one of the things he writes about is that he wondered if he did the right thing. He thought people would think he was a coward because he went to Switzerland. This bothered him so much that he ended up creating OCD. This is a form of PTSD that no one figured out. So for 70 years, he had throat problems, he became OCD, he had all kinds of stuff because he felt guilty that he had flown to Switzerland and saved his 9 guys. And one of the things that had happened was when he went back to his base before he came back to the United States, one of the guys in the other plane said, "Oh, well, I saw when you were going down, you had all 4 engines running," which he didn't. And the guy just made this offhand remark to this 19-year-old, and that tore him apart, and he thought it. And then 15 years later, he's in a golf course in Florida, and he thinks he sees the captain from the squadron he was in. And he says, "Captain Jacobs, Captain Jacobs." And the guy continues walking. Now, he's already suffering from PTSD. He already feels like he's screwed up. So he feels that Captain Jacobs saw him and walked away because he went to Switzerland. So then, 70 years later, a guy out of nowhere, his hobby is tracking down like every single bomber mission, whatever, with the 15th Air Force. He gets the Swiss records, where the Swiss did an inspection of his airplane and said, these engines were, this is what's wrong with them, you never would have made it over the Alps. And then he tracks down the Air Force, the same man that he's never met, goes into all the different Air Force papers, gets stuff out of Air Force archives, and finds out that he had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross before he left. But the letter never caught up with him. He never got it. So for 70 years, this guy, he'd had surgery on his neck, he had all kinds of stuff done, and it wasn't until 2018, he's in his 90s, that he starts feeling good, both physically and about himself. And it's like, it's unbelievable. It's a fantastic, fantastic book. There was another mission which, for some reason, disappeared into the ether world. There was a mission called Operation Gun. Has anybody ever heard of that? So Halyard there's a book that came out, and it's called The Forgotten 500. And a lot of information came out of the archives after a number of years, 20 or 30 years, and it's the biggest rescue mission of the war. Well, it's not. There's Operation Gun. There was over 1,000 prisoners in Romanian POW camps. When Romania switched sides, the Romanians didn't want the Germans to get them, and they also didn't want the Russians to get them. The Russians are just outside the Romanian border. So they contact a senior American officer. He had just been shot down 5 days before, and the top Romanian air ace starts talking to him and says, "Look, I'll fly you to Italy, and we'll see if we can set up a rescue mission." So they decide to do it. They take a 2-engine bomber, and they take off, and this guy, Colonel Gunn, is going to go to Italy, to Bari, tell the 15th Air Force, "We got all these guys, the Romanians are willing to give them back to you." Well, the pilot flying the 2-engine bomber chickens out, flies back, and comes home. So the top Romanian air ace, who also, by the way, had gold medal in a couple stuff, had like 40 victories, both against Americans and Russians, says, well, I'll fly you. And so what they do is they take out the radio out of the side compartment of an ME-109, and Captain Gunn, or Colonel Gunn, climbs in there. So if anything happens to the plane, it's going down. He's nothing, no oxygen or anything else. Gunn says, I think you should fly at 500 feet. The Romanian says, no, I'm going to fly at 12,000 feet because I don't trust my airplane, so that if I'm up high enough, I can do something about it. So he stuffs Gunn into the fuselage of this ME-109. They fly for 2 hours. They get there. They get to one of the air bases. By the way, the ME-109, because it disappeared into the Ethernet, the ME-109, they painted a huge American flag on it, on both sides of the airplane, so nobody would shoot it down. So they land on the base. They open the door. He's suffering from hypoxia. He's almost dead because he's almost out of oxygen. So they revive him, they take him to the air base, and then they decide to make this mission. So within 3 days, the 15th Air Force strips a bunch of B-17s, and they fly them to the Romanian air base and bring these guys all home. And then the Romanian pilot that flew the mission, he was able to stay one step ahead of the communists because he had shot down so many Russians. He was on a hit list. So that's the Gunn mission, a second one, which it's gone. I don't know what happened to it, but it's a great story, but nobody knows about it. You got to find rabbit holes if you want to learn this stuff. Because anyway, so all these guys, they same thing, stuffed them into these B-17s and then flew them out. And you got to remember now, they're flying these things out. They took all the guns off, everything, and they're flying these unarmed B-17s out over enemy territory back into Italy. There's 3 U.S. senators that flew with the 15th: George McGovern, Lloyd Benson, and William Hathaway. Now here's a great ending to the thing. This is Albert Speer. I could see the omens of the war's end almost every day in the blue southern sky when, flying provocatively low, the bombers of the American 15th Air Force crossed from the Alps from the Italian bases to attack German industrial targets. That's a post-war interview. So Albert Speer definitely felt that the 15th Air Force made a horrendous difference to German output during the war. I forgot more than I forgot so much stuff. Anyway, you don't know that. Here's 2 great books. The Forgotten 15th, an appropriate book. Now, if you read book Masters of the Air, one of the advantages that Miller had, Miller started interviewing survivors 85 and 1990s, stuff like that. Barrett Tillman, who's written 30 or 40 books on World War II, didn't start interviewing people until the late 90s and in the early 2000s. So the number of people that he was able to interview. And then this is Flying with the 15th. This is Tom Faulkner. They can't prove it, but they think he's the youngest pilot that they had, with hitting 28 missions before his 20th birthday. And this is a fantastic book because it has all this great information, little tidbits, and then the editor was able to then go through and make sure that all the little tidbits that he was giving were all correct. So if he talks about this plane or that plane, everything's checked out. And one of the things I found out flying with the 15th, when I said they're the red-headed stepchild, so Faulkner shows up towards the end of 1944. Remember, you read about the 8th Air Force, everybody's in a Quonset hut, and on the weekends you can take a bus into London, all these different things. Faulkner and his crew, they slept in a 4-man tent, was the 4 officers, and 20 feet away was the 6 enlisted guys. There's no officers club, there's an officer's mess and an enlisted mess. There's no showers. He took 1 shower in 6 months. There was nowhere to wash his uniform. He flew in the same uniform pieces that he got there with. He just didn't wear his dress uniform. There was none of the stuff that there is in the 8th Air Force. And he doesn't say it like, screw the 8th Air Force, but he's just talking about the differences. He saw 1 girl in 6 months. And that's when he was in Barry, which was the same place he was able to take a shower. The only shower facilities was a water truck out in a field, and this is all the time, out in the field with just a huge hose. and you washed yourself off. Most guys said, forget it, it's too cold. The other thing that, when I was talking about geography, they figured that it was going to be better. It wasn't. Those fields, for the majority of the fields, they were metal planks, and they all flooded during the spring. And so you had all kinds of accidents with the 15th trying to take off. For some reason, the Italians had no clue how to pour concrete. And so they talk about the different tents that they would build them a base. The Italians would come in, build them a base, but they had no idea how to pour concrete. As soon as it rained, everything dissolved. And then no one's going to worry about any of this stuff, and no one's going to complain because they don't know what to complain, they have no clue what they don't have. It's just amazing talking about the stuff, but there was one other neat part. When they left, he flew from Miami it was from Newfoundland. I can't figure this one out. They flew from Newfoundland to the Azores, and then from the Azores to Marrakesh, across North Africa, and into Italy. He had a brand new airplane. Of course, when these crews flew these brand new airplanes over, they never got the brand new airplane. Like, here's the airplane, Colonel, fine, get your junk out of here, it's going to somebody else. But on the airplane, there was a case, a huge crate in the center of the airplane, right near the Bombay doors, and they had no idea what it was. Now, these guys are all kids, so they don't open it. They figure, well, the Air Force knows what they're doing. Somebody's going to pick this thing up. They land the plane, nobody comes to get the box. So then they figure, well, let's open the box. And in the box was 1,000 K rations. And so, of course, they stole the K rations and split them up. And he said that for the 6 months that he was there, that's what they ate a lot of times, because you could open them up and there might be some cheese. He said they didn't want the Spam and some of the other stuff, but he started smoking. So he got 2 cigarettes for each box. And so all the guys survived. Each guy got 100 K rations that they stuck in their tent. And if you just compare the conditions between the 15th and the 8th, it's day and night. It's unbelievable. Like you always say, you can't make it up. So, anybody any questions? I don't take questions. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Total comment, not a question. I understand the 15th did not have a 20 mission limit.
No, the 35, 30, no, all of them went up. As the fighters started to disappear and we started to get more control of the air, the number of missions creeped up. And if you want to read a great book, read Catch-22. That's the whole thing with Yossarian. He's in the 15th Air Force. And every time he's one mission away, poof, they add 5 more to him. And and that's the Catch-22. It just keeps going. But some of these guys too, if you go through his book here, there's a lot of guys, 48, 50, 60 missions. They just stayed and kept flying. And as you started going towards Ploiești, the Germans eventually gave up trying to defend that area. And then they started flying with only one waist gunner. They were still very dangerous missions, but the casualty rates plummeted as a result of lack of fighter pilot. Now, one of the other things about flak, the majority of the planes that were lost on the 15th were lost to flak. And one of the things that both bomber commands did was it caused the Germans to assign 1.1 million men and women to flak units. And that's a lot of people. And if you figure, half of it's men, that's 500,000 men that weren't in the infantry. Also, by having to produce all the flak shells and the flak cannons, that took production away from tanks, took production away from all the other things that could have been used on the battlefield. So being used as bait, which they were, was extremely useful to the war. Yes?
Quick question. 2 quick questions. Turkey, did they get interned there in
Yeah.
Turkey when they flew over and landed for the rest
Only if they landed, yeah.
for the rest of the war?
Yep.
Okay. And
The Turks did not shoot them down.
Okay. And then my next question, the Red Tail, Lieutenant Colonel Stewart just died on February 2nd with the 332nd.
332nd Fighter Group.
Do you know much about him?
That's the Red Tails,
He's
no.
one of the last ones. And, but they were part of the 15th?
Right, they were one of the fighter groups. Now, one of the things about them, if you know any of the story about the Tuskegee Airmen, the 15th got the last of everything, and then in the 15th, The Tuskegee got the last of everything. So they were the last guys to get the P-51s. They were the last guys to get whatever you needed to keep, to keep operational. So that's why they had the victory sign. You're fighting two things. You're fighting the Germans and you're fighting, racism at home. But that's the whole thing. When you start, like I said, you go down a rabbit hole. You could talk forever on on any one of these different groups. You can talk about in a second. You can talk about the 15th working with the landings in southern France. Monte Cassino. Anybody know about Monte Cassino? Okay, this big, huge Benedictine monastery has been built in the 5th century, the 7th century, or something like that. Kesselring, the German guy, the head of the German defenses in Italy, contacts the Pope, and he contacts British intelligence, he contacts the Americans. He says, I won't put any soldiers in there. Don't do anything. I'm not putting anybody in there. The Brits, of course, they never believe anybody about anything. So they said, well, we don't believe you. So the 15th Air Force sent a mission out to flatten it, which they did. They flattened the place. The 12th Air Force was also involved in it. Then we had this massive artillery barrage and just destroyed the whole place. And it took 5 months, and God knows how many dead allies, to get the Germans out of the ruins of Monte Cassino. The other thing that happened at Monte Cassino, because we could do daylight precision bombing, was we had all the artillery and all the tank units and everybody, they're at the base of the mountain. So we send in the bombers, and there was all kinds of friendly fire deaths. One of the friendly fire deaths, I don't know, it wasn't Twinning, one of the senior officers above Twinning was there, and they almost blew him up. And so as a result, he contacts Twinning, and Twinning's the head of the 15th Air Force, and he says, if you fly any more planes this close to friendly lines, you need to have a senior officer there, basically as bait. You need to have a senior officer there to make sure this doesn't happen again. So Twinning sends somebody from his general staff, they almost kill him. And then as a result of that, Twinning then goes back and has a reinvigorated program for bombardiers and navigators. Because what had happened is we're pushing these guys out, so many of the men never finished their training. You'd be halfway through navigation school, and then they'd send you to the 15th Air Force. And so you're trying to expect these guys to do precision navigation when nothing's going on. So it's 5 months later that they were able to go through. That wasn't the 15th's fault, but they did flatten Monte Cassino. Yeah.
I know Eisenhower and Doolittle had a difference of opinion about air power. So was Eisenhower instrumental in why so many of these planes were getting hit by the flak and all that, because he didn't believe in air?
No, he believed in air power. The powers that be that wanted to create a United States Air Force, they believed through Dume, which was an Italian military strategist, saying that through heavy bombing, you can force a country to submit, and you won't have to put troops on the ground. And that's one of the things that our heads believed in the military, was we can bomb them into submission. It didn't work. It helped, but it didn't work. And then when it came to the invasion of Normandy, Eisenhower's in charge of it. He told the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force, these are the specific things I want you to hit. And I want you to hit transportation centers, and I want you to hit fighter manufacturing ahead of time. Well, the guys run Twinning and Spatz kind of wink, wink, no, let's keep going after Ploeshti. So there's all kinds of political machinations going on there. And that's why it's interesting on the first mission with Ploeshti, where they went, just fly there and come home, that Eisenhower makes that comment in early 1942, well, I guess your philosophy about being able to bomb a country into submission doesn't really hold water. So that was an argument the whole time. But the main thing is, the whole time, everybody's fighting for resources. It's easy to take one sector of the war and look at it and say, well, they should have gotten this, they should have gotten that. Well, like I said, if you take a ship from Norfolk, who's stealing what off that ship every place it goes before it ends up all the way at the other side of the Mediterranean? So.
Was the 57th Fighter Squadron, whose restaurant is at PDK, was that part of the team?
Actually, they were flying P-47s out of the Africa.
Yeah.
Initially, P-40s and then P-47s. There were 3 squadrons. The 57th Fire Group ended up in Italy. That's what the last one was. But actually, it was real.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah.
Dan, the pilot who landed in Switzerland made reference to a book. What was the name of the book?
Right here, Flying with the 15th, Tom Faulkner. And this is a great book, like I said, because the editor, he has his diary, and he wrote down everything on his diary as he came back and just things that were going on. So with what the editor did was to make sure it's not just a war diary where we don't know if any of this stuff is true. The footnotes are about half a page each time. So when he talks about different crewmen that were on the plane, the editor tracked it down through Air Force records who actually flew with him. The Air Force, he then finds crash records. He then finds all these different records to show that Faulkner was telling the truth. Not that Faulkner was going to lie, but this is 50 years after the fact that he writes it. And not the editor, but a friend of the editor is the guy who researched it and found out that 70 years earlier he should have gotten the Distinguished Flying Cross, and that the Air Force said absolutely you landing in Switzerland was the most important thing to do. But for 70 years he felt like hell the whole time. Never went to any reunions, nothing. Didn't want to see anybody from the 15th Air Force because he felt that he didn't measure up. I mean, try to imagine the pressure. It's just...
Well, Dan, thank you so much.
You're welcome.